those are not just proposals. I mean, they're being implemented every day, going on constantly. Well, those proposals can be implemented only if there's no resistance to them. Now, in the West Bank, by now, there's very little resistance because of Israeli violence, which has indeed subdued the population, and by now because of collaborationist Palestinian forces. As I'm sure you know, the United States, with its allies, the Arab dictatorships, Jordan, Egypt, have trained security forces, Fatah security forces, whose main task is to subdue the population. So if they have a demonstration, against the atrocities in Gaza, then instead of the Israeli army going in, they'll do it. That's a typical colonial pattern. It's the whole history of colonialism works like that. I won't run through the details, but it's absolutely common, very common. So like, say, India was, the population was mostly kept under control by Indian soldiers under British command. And it's just a typical and natural procedure. In Chechnya today, it's kept subdued and quiet and developing and so on under Chechen military forces, with the Russians in the background in case anything goes wrong. It's routine, and it's being duplicated in the West Bank. Well, okay, they've pretty much subdued protest in the West Bank so that you can carry out the policies without disturbance, but they haven't yet subdued Gaza. Gaza, you still have resistance. Now remember, Gaza and the West Bank are one unit. And furthermore, they are both occupied. There's no question that Gaza is occupied. Even as sane Israeli commentators point out that there's never been a day that it hasn't been under occupation. There's talk about, the famous disengagement, but that was a well-organized scam. Hardliners in Israel, like Ariel Sharon, the patron saint of the settlers, understood that it's completely senseless to keep several thousand Jewish settlers in the ruins of Gaza, which they had already pretty much destroyed, taking a large part of the land and the scarce resources like water, and protected from 1.5 million people by a big component of the IDF, the Israeli army. That's just crazy. So what makes sense is to essentially transfer them to valuable territory. They're subsidized to go to Gaza, so fine, you load them up in trucks and take them over to be illegally subsidized in the West Bank, which you want to keep, which is what happened. I mean, when they announced the disengagement, they also, at the same time, announced new settlement programs in the West Bank. Most of them went there. Some went to the illegally occupied Golan Heights. That's almost all of them. This had to be presented as a trauma, a national trauma, because you had to have images on the front pages of the newspapers about, you may remember the Boston Globe, pathetic little boy, pleading with the soldiers not to take them away, and destroying their homes. You can have cries of "never again." It's kind of like the Nazis and so on. They're all totally faked. I mean, if they wanted to remove the settlers, there was nothing easier. They could have simply announced on August 1st, the Israeli army is going to leave Gaza. 2 days later, the people who lived there would have climbed into the lorries provided for them and quietly gone to their new subsidized homes in the illegally settlements in the West Bank. But then you wouldn't have had a national trauma, and you wouldn't be able to shout "never again" and so on. There's a lesson in this, because it also has to do with the possibilities of dealing with the settlements in the occupied territories. In the rest of the occupied territories, the West Bank, it's very commonly argued that if the Israeli army, that there's no possibility of a two-state settlement, because if the Israeli army tried to forcefully remove the settlers, there would be a civil war. And that's probably true. The religious nationalist settlers have such a powerful role inside Israel, in particular in the Israeli army, that they might just refuse to carry, especially at the officer corps. Many of them obey the rabbis, not the state, openly. So yes, they might refuse to do it, have battles, could be a civil war. But there's no reason for any of that. To eliminate the settlements in the West Bank is a trivial move. Just withdraw the army, and the settlers will divide. Many of them are just there because they're paid to have a decent quality of life. Okay, so they'll go back and be paid to be within the borders of Israel. There will be nationalist religious groups that'll fight to hang on to every, clod of earth. Okay, they can be left to their own devices. They can stay under Palestinian authority, or they can leave too. But there doesn't have to be any civil war, and there doesn't have to be any force. The mechanisms are straightforward. So that's not a barrier to proceeding to a political settlement. And this has been done. There are many examples of this. Just to take one recent one, which was pretty dramatic, but can't be discussed here because of what it implies. Indonesia in 1975 invaded East Timor. And what happens about as close to genocide as anything in the modern period. They killed hundreds of thousands of people, maybe a quarter of the population, strongly backed by the United States, also Britain when the atrocities mounted, others. And they swore they were never going to leave. The general said, it's part of Indonesia, we're going to keep it, nothing the world can do about it. Well, in September 1999, under, by then, very serious international and domestic pressure, Clinton decided that it's enough. He told the Indonesian generals, sorry, friends, the game is over, and they immediately withdrew. You can't stand up to the Godfather. It's just too dangerous. So, okay, that was the end of that. Now, that's gone down in history as a humanitarian intervention by the United States. Look how humanitarian we are. First, we supported the invasion, for 25 years, helped them destroy the population. And then when it just became too much of a bother to us, we told them to call it off. Okay, and they called it off. Okay. International affairs is, there aren't many principles of international affairs, although scholars will tell you there are. But one principle that works pretty well is that international affairs are very much like the mafia. And there's a godfather, and you better obey him, or else you're in trouble. And then there are what are called the intellectuals, who explain to you that what the godfather is doing is humane and just, and the divine mission, and so on and so forth. This is pretty much the way it works. And the same could work in the rest of the occupied territories. Let's go back to the question of legitimacy of the attack. Are there peaceful alternatives for Israel when they're under rocket attack? Well,